Outlaw legends present, ashes of the plains. The sun hung low and merciless over the Texas plains, a blood-red disk bleeding into the horizon. Jack Crow squinted through the haze, his hat-brim shading eyes that had seen too much, too many dry miles, too many dead men, too many promises broken like brittle twigs underfoot. The cattle lowed behind him, a restless sea of hides and horns, stretching across the cracked earth, their hooves kicking up dust that clung to his throat. He'd been driving them for weeks, a solitary figure carved from leather and grit. His past a shadow stitched tight to his heels. The herd was his charge, his penance, his way out of a life he'd rather forget. But the smoke ahead, thin, black, curling like a snake against the sky, told him trouble didn't care about a man's plans. He spurred his mare, a wiry roan named Sage, toward the ridge. The herd could wait. The drovers, 3 green boys and an old hand named Tuck, would keep them steady. Jack's gut twisted as the wind carried the acrid bite of burning wood and something worse, flesh maybe, or the sour tang of fear. He crested the rise and reined up sharp. Below, an Apache camp lay in ruin. Hides and poles smoldered, scattered like bones picked clean. A few shapes moved among the wreckage, survivors, he reckoned, though the heat shimmer made it hard to tell. Horses were gone, their tracks cutting east through the dust. And there, near the center, a lone figure knelt by a fire that still licked at a fallen lodge. Jack's hand drifted to the Colt at his hip, thumb brushing the worn grip. He'd seen raids before, Comanche mostly, tearing through settlements like a storm. But this wasn't that. The camp was small, a hunting party maybe, not a village worth sacking. His eyes narrowed as the kneeling figure straightened, turning toward him. A flash of recognition hit like a slug to the chest. It was Elias, his scout, a rangy man with a crooked grin and a knack for finding water where none should be. Elias held a torch in one hand, the other resting on a knife sheathed at his belt. Behind him, a string of Apache ponies stood tethered to a scrub oak, heads low and tails flicking. "Elias," Jack's voice rasped out, dry as the wind. The scout's head snapped up, and for a moment, their gazes locked. Jack's steel hard, Elias's flickering with something caught between guilt and defiance. Then Elias bolted, sprinting for the horses, torch dropped to sputter in the dirt. Jack cursed under his breath and kicked Sage into a gallop, the mare's hooves pounding the slope. He could have drawn and fired, put a bullet in the man's back, but his hand stayed clear of the Colt. Elias had ridden with him 3 months, shared his fire, his whiskey. Betrayal stung worse than a scorpion, but Jack wanted answers before blood. The gap closed fast, 50 yards, 30-10, but Elias reached the ponies and cut one loose, swinging up bareback with a grace that mocked his treachery. He wheeled the horse east and drove it hard, vanishing to the dust. Jack reined Sage to a halt, breath heaving, fists clenched around the reins. The scout was gone, taking the horses and whatever drove him to torch the camp. Jack's jaw tightened. He'd find him, drag him back, make him explain. But then a cry cut the air, sharp, raw, human. He turned. Down in the camp, the survivors had seen him. 3 figures emerged from the smoke, a woman with a blood-streaked face, a boy clutching a broken bow, and an old man leaning on a staff. Their eyes burned with hate, fixed on Jack astride his horse, his silhouette framed against the ridge. To them, he wasn't a stranger riding in. He was part of this. The white man with the herd, the one whose scout brought fire and ruin. The woman shouted something in Apache, a word Jack didn't know but felt like a blade. The boy knocked an arrow, trembling but steady enough to aim. Jack raised a hand, palm out, his voice low and even. "I ain't your enemy." The words sounded hollow even to him. The camp smoked behind them. The herd rumbled in the distance, and Elias's tracks stretched east like a taunt. He could ride after the trader, chase him down before nightfall if he pushed Sage hard. Or he could stay, face the survivors, prove he wasn't what they thought. The boy's arrow quivered, the woman's glare sharpened, and the old man took a step closer, staff tapping the ground like a judge's gavel. Then the earth shook. A low rumble rolled up from the plains, not thunder but hooves, hundreds, maybe more, coming fast. Jack twisted in the saddle. Dust boiled on the horizon, too thick for his drovers, too wild for the herd. Riders, Apache likely, drawn by the smoke, come to find their kin slaughtered, and a lone cowboy standing over the ashes. The woman's cry turned triumphant. The boy's arrow steadied, and Jack's world tipped hard. Elias's betrayal had lit a fuse, and now it was burning down to him. Jack Crow didn't wait for the arrow to fly. He yanked Sage's reins hard, wheeling her toward the ridge as the boy's bowstring twanged. The shaft hissed past his ear, close enough to feel its breath, and buried itself in the dirt. Behind him, the woman's voice rose again, sharp and commanding, but Jack didn't look back. The rumble of hooves grew louder, a storm swelling from the south, and he knew the Apache riders would crest the horizon any moment. His mare hit the slope at a dead run, muscles bunching under her sweat-slick hide, and Jack leaned low, spurs biting just enough to keep her flying. The herd was his anchor, his shield. If he could reach it, the drovers might buy him time. If not, he'd be a lone man against a war party, and he'd seen how those odds ended. The plains stretched wide and unforgiving, a sea of yellow grass baked brittle by the sun. Sage's hooves churned dust, her breath coming in ragged snorts, but she held steady. Jack's mind raced faster than the mare. Elias, damn him, hadn't just burned a camp and stolen horses. He'd painted a target on Jack's back, left him to face the fallout. The scout knew these trails, knew the herd's pace, knew Jack wouldn't let betrayal slide. East he'd gone, toward the scrub hills where a man could vanish like smoke. Jack's knuckles whitened on the reins. He'd track him, gut him if it came to that, but first he had to live through the next hour. The herd came into view, a shifting mass of cattle, bawling and milling under the drovers' shouts. Tuck, the old hand, rode point, his gray beard streaked with dust, while the three boys, Will, Sam, and little Pete, worked the flanks, their yells thin against the wind. Jack hollered as he closed in, voice cracking like a whip. "Riders coming! South! Get the herd tight!" Tuck's head snapped up, eyes narrowing under his battered hat, and he barked orders without hesitation. The boys scrambled, whips snapping, pushing the cattle into a denser knot. 1,000 head wouldn't stop a war party, but it might slow them, give Jack a chance to think. He slid from Sage's back near Tuck, boots hitting the ground hard. The old man swung down too, rifle already in hand, his weathered face creased deeper than usual. "Apache?" Tuck asked, spitting a wad of tobacco into the dirt. Jack nodded, breath still short. "Smoke drew 'em. Camp's burned. Elias did it. Took their horses." Tuck's jaw tightened, but he didn't curse or question. He'd ridden with Jack long enough to know trouble found them, whether they sought it or not. "How many?" he pressed. Jack glanced south. The dust cloud loomed closer, dark shapes flickering within it. 20, maybe more. Armed." Tuck grunted, slinging the rifle over his shoulder. "Boys ain't ready for this." Jack's gaze flicked to Will, barely 17, wrestling his skittish gelding, then to Sam and Pete, their faces pale under wide-brimmed hats. Green as grass, all three hired cheap out of San Antonio. They'd signed on for cattle, not blood. "They'll have to be," Jack said, a voice flat. He drew his Colt, checking the cylinder, 6 rounds, plus a dozen more in his saddlebag. Not enough, but it's due. The riders broke into view then, a line of silhouettes against the dying light. 25, Jack counted, maybe 30, their ponies lean and fast, feathers and war paint catching the sun. A war cry split the air, high and wild, and the cattle spooked, lunging against the drover's hold. Tuck fired a shot skyward, the crack steadying the boys, but Jack knew it wouldn't stop what was coming. The Apache fanned out, cutting a wide arc around the herd, their eyes locked on him. The woman from the camp rode among them, her blood-streaked face a banner of vengeance, pointing straight at Jack. He stood his ground. Colt loose in his hand, Sage's reins looped over his arm. "Tuck, take the boys west," he said low. "Keep the herd moving. I'll draw 'em off." Tuck's brow furrowed, but he nodded. He knew a lost fight when he saw one. "Don't die, Crow," he muttered, then swung back into the saddle, shouting for the boys to ride. Jack mounted Sage as the drovers peeled away, the herd lumbering west in a cloud of dust and bellows. The Apache didn't follow them. Their focus stayed on Jack, closing the arc like a noose. He spurred Sage east, toward the hills where Elias had fled, the only cover for miles. The plains blurred beneath him, wind tearing at his coat, the mare's stride eating ground. Hooves thundered behind, gaining fast. Apache ponies were bred for this, light and tireless, while Sage carried a man's weight and 3 weeks of trail dust. Jack risked a glance back. The woman led the pack, a bow in her hands now, her scream cutting through the din. An arrow arced past, then another, one grazing Sage's flank. The mare faltered, a sharp whinny escaping her, but Jack urged her on, blood hot in his veins. The hills rose ahead, jagged and scrub-choked, a maze of gullies and ridges. If he could reach them, lose the riders in the twists, he might live to see dusk. But the gap was shrinking. 50 yards, 40, 30, and Sage's breath rattled like a bellows. An arrow thudded into the earth beside him. Another clipped his hat, sending it spinning into the grass. Jack cursed, low and fierce, and drew the Colt, firing blind over his shoulder. The shots bought him seconds, the riders swerving, but not enough. Then the ground dropped. A dry wash yawned ahead, hidden by the grass, too wide to jump. Jack hauled Sage to a stop, the mare skidding on loose dirt, hooves teetering at the edge. 10 feet down, steep and rocky, no way across, no time to circle. He wheeled her around, facing the riders as they closed in, dust swirling like a shroud. The woman reined up 20 yards off, arrow knocked, her eyes burning into his. Behind her, the others fanned out, rifles and bows raised, a half circle of death. Jack's Colt hung heavy in his hand, 5 rounds left. Sage trembled beneath him, blood streaking her flank. The woman shouted, her voice raw with fury, and the riders tightened their grip. Jack's pulse pounded, a drumbeat in his skull. East lay Elias's trail, west the herd, south the war party, and here he stood, caught in the jaws of a trap he hadn't set. The woman's bowstring creaked, and the hills loomed silent, waiting. Jack Crow stared down the woman's arrow, the taut string a heartbeat from snapping. Her eyes held no mercy, only a fire stoked by the ashes of her kin. And the riders flanking her mirrored that rage, faces painted with ochre and soot, rifles glinting in the fading sun. Sage shifted beneath him, her wounded flank twitching. But Jack kept her steady, reins tight in one hand, Colt steady in the other. 5 shots, 30 foes. The math didn't bend, but he'd faced worse and walked away breathing. The wash at his back was a wall, the hills a taunt, just out of reach. He'd have to talk or fight, and his tongue felt as dry as his luck. "You want me?" he called, voice rough but carrying. "I'm here. Your horses are gone east. My man took 'em. I didn't light that fire." The woman's gaze didn't waver, but her lips tightened, a flicker of doubt or calculation. Jack pressed it. "I'm after him, too. Let me ride and I'll bring him back. Dead or alive, your call. It was a gamble, thin as a razor's edge. Apache didn't parley with strangers, least of all a white man standing over their dead. But he'd seen vengeance trump pride before. The woman barked something sharp in her tongue, and the old man from the camp nudged his pony forward, staff tapping the saddle horn. His eyes, clouded but keen, raked over Jack like a blade skinning hide. The old man spoke, voice low and guttural, words Jack couldn't catch. The woman listened, then spat into the dirt, her arrow dipping an inch. She answered in halting English, each syllable a shard of glass. You lie, cowman. You're fire. You're thief. We take you now. Jack's gut clenched, but he kept his face stone. Then you'll lose him, he said. And those horses. I know where he's headed. Hills east. Trails I've run. You don't. Her bow steadied again, but the old man raised a hand, silencing the murmurs among the riders. He muttered something, and she snapped back, their voices clashing like flint on steel. Jack held still, breath shallow, counting seconds. The old man won. The woman's bow lowered, not from trust, but from something colder, strategy maybe. She pointed east, then at Jack, her meaning clear. Ride, find the thief, or die trying. You fail, she said. We find you. Slow death. Jack nodded once, sharp, and holstered the Colt. No point in pushing further. He'd bought a thread of time. Nothing more. The riders parted, a grudging gap, and he spurred Sage through, her hooves kicking dust into their faces. The wash forced him north a spell before he could swing east, but the hills loomed closer now, a jagged promise of cover. Night fell fast as he rode, the sun swallowed by the plains, stars pricking through a sky gone bruise purple. Sage limped, her flank oozing dark, and Jack cursed Elias again under his breath. He'd pushed her too hard, but stopping wasn't an option. Not with the Apache trailing, watching from a distance he couldn't see but felt in his bones. The hills rose around him, scrub oak and mesquite clawing at the slopes, gullies cutting shadows deep as graves. Elias's tracks were faint, scuffed by wind, but Jack knew these trails from years dodging rustlers and lawmen alike. The scout would head for the breaks, a tangle of ravines where a man could hole up or slip through to the Red River. He dismounted near a trickle of a creek, letting Sage drink while he tore a strip from his shirt to bind her wound. The mare nickered soft, trusting, and Jack's chest tightened. She'd carried him through hell, and he'd repay her with more miles. Rest easy, girl, he murmured, patting her neck. The silence pressed in, broken only by the creek's gurgle and a distant coyote's yowl. Then a twig snapped, sharp, close. Jack's hand flew to the Colt, eyes scanning the dark. A shadow shifted, not 20 yards off, a low and human. He crouched, gun leveled, heart steady now. Elias, he hissed. That you? No answer, but the shadow froze, then edged back. Jack fired, the shot cracking the night, and the figure bolted, crashing through brush. Not Elias, too small, too quick. Jack lunged after it, boots slipping on loose rock, the chase pulling him deeper into the gully. The figure darted behind a boulder, and Jack slowed, breath fogging in the chill. He circled wide, Colt raised, and caught a glimpse. Ragged clothes, bare feet, a boy no more than 12. Apache, maybe, or some drifter's whelp lost out here. Easy, Jack said, lowering the gun a hair. I ain't here to hurt you. The boy peered out, eyes wide and wild, a knife clutched in his fist, small but sharp enough. Jack took a step, and the boy lunged, blade flashing. Jack sidestepped, caught the wrist, and twisted, sending the knife spinning into the dirt. The boy thrashed, all sinew and panic, until Jack pinned him, knee to chest. Stop it, damn you, he growled. The boy stilled, panting, and Jack saw the fear wasn't just for him. Something else had this kid running. Who are you with? Jack asked, easing off but keeping a grip. The boy spat, then muttered, "No one. They're dead." His English was rough, accented but clear. Jack's brow creased. "Who's dead?" The boy's eyes darted east, toward the breaks. "Men! Bad men! Horses!" Jack's pulse quickened. "Elias?" He loosed the boy, who scrambled back but didn't run. "You seen a rider? Tall, crooked teeth?" The boy nodded, slow, then pointed deeper into the hills. "There. With others. They kill." Jack stood, mind racing. Elias hadn't just fled. He'd joined up, maybe with outlaws holed in the breaks. Horse thieves, killers, a crew mean enough to spook this kid into hiding. The Apache wanted their ponies back, but now Jack had a bigger mess. His traitor scout riding with a pack that could turn these hills into a slaughterhouse. He glanced at the boy, who clutched his knees, shivering. "You stayin' or comin'?" Jack asked. The boy hesitated, then rose, knife retrieved but sheathed. "Comin'," he said, voice small but firm. They moved together. Jack leading Sage, the boy, nameless still, scouting ahead like a ghost. The hills tightened around them, air thick with pine and danger. An hour in, the boy froze, finger to lips, and Jack heard it. Voices low and rough, drifting from a ravine below. Firelight flickered, faint but real. Jack tethered Sage to a scrub oak and crept closer, the boy at his side. Through the brush he saw them, 6 men, Elias among them, hunched around a fire, Apache horses tethered nearby. A 7th figure lay bound, bloodied, an Apache warrior by his garb. Elias laughed, a sound Jack knew too well, and drove a boot into the prisoner's ribs. Jack's jaw clenched, rage simmering low. The boy gripped his arm, whispering, "More. In trees." Jack squinted, catching the glints of steel, lookouts, maybe 3 or 4. Outnumbered, outgunned, and the Apache closing from behind. He'd found Elias, but the trap had teeth now, and they were sharpening fast. Jack Crow crouched in the scrub, the boy's warning a cold weight in his gut. The firelight below danced over Elias and his crew, 6 at the camp, plus lookouts in the trees, maybe 10 total. The bound Apache warrior groaned under Elias's boot, blood pooling dark beneath him, while the stolen ponies stamped nervously at their tethers. Jack's Colt felt heavy in his hand, 5 rounds left, a laughable tally against this lot. The boy, still nameless, all sharp edges and silence, pressed close, his knife a dull gleam in the starlight. Behind them, Sage stood tethered, her breath a faint rasp in the night. The hills loomed tight, a cage of rock and shadow, and somewhere out there the Apache war party circled closer, drawn by vengeance and the scent of smoke. Jack's mind churned, sifting options like gravel through a pan. Rush the camp, and the lookouts would cut him down before he reached Elias. Wait, and the Apache would find them all, turning this ravine into a killing ground. Elias had to die, that was certain, but the how of it gnawed at him. The scout's laugh rang out again, grating like a blade on bone, and Jack's fingers tightened on the Colt. He'd trusted that laugh once, shared a fire with it, and now it mocked him from the heart of this mess. The boy tugged his sleeve, eyes darting to the ridge above the camp. "Hi," he whispered. "See all." Jack nodded, slow. The ridge could work. Cover, a vantage, maybe a shot at Elias if the angle held. He gestured for the boy to lead, and they slipped through the brush, silent as wolves. Sage left behind to rest her wounded flank. The climb was steep, roots snagging at boots, loose stone threatening to betray them with every step. Jack's breath burned in his chest, but the boy moved like he'd been born to these hills, guiding them to a lip of rock overlooking the fire. Below, Elias paced, barking orders while 2 men dragged the Apache prisoner to his knees, a knife flashing in the glow. Jack settled behind a boulder, Colt resting on the stone, sights trained on Elias. 50 yards, A tough shot in the dark, but he'd made worse. The boy crouched beside him, watching the trees, his knife ready for the lookouts. Jack couldn't see. "Stay low," Jack murmured. "They move, you holler." The boy dipped his head, and Jack steadied his aim, finger brushing the trigger. One shot to drop Elias, then chaos. Maybe enough to slip away before the crew rallied. He exhaled, slow and even, the world narrowing to the scout's crooked grin. A twig snapped. Not below, behind. Jack spun, Colt swinging up, but too late. A shadow loomed. A rifle butt crashed against his skull, and stars burst white-hot behind his eyes. He hit the ground, gun skittering from his grip, the boy's shout cut short by a grunt. Rough hands hauled Jack up, a lookout's snarled curse ringing in his ears. The ridge blurred, 2 men, maybe 3, dragging him and the boy down the slope, rocks biting into his knees. The camp came alive as they were dumped at the fire's edge, Elias turning with a grin that split his face like a wound. "Well, damn, Crow," Elias drawled, stepping close. "Knew you'd sniff me out." His boot lashed out, catching Jack's ribs, and pain flared sharp and bright. Jack spat blood, glaring up through a swelling eye. The boy struggled beside him, pinned by a burly man with a scarred lip, his knife lost in the dirt. Elias crouched, close enough Jack could smell the whiskey on his breath. "Thought you'd play hero, huh? Trail's done, boss. Herd's tucks now. These boys—" He jerked a thumb at the crew. "They pay better'n cattle." Jack's voice rasped out, low and steady. "You burned 'em, Elias. Apache. They're coming." Elias laughed, sharp and ugly. "Let 'em. We'll be gone before they sniff this far." He stood, nodding to the scarred man. "Time with the redskin. We ride at dawn." Ropes bit into Jack's wrists as he was shoved beside the Apache prisoner. The boy lashed tight on his other flank. The warrior's eyes met his, dark, unreadable, but alive with hate. Jack didn't flinch. They were bound in this now, whether they liked it or not. The crew settled, passing a bottle, their chatter a dull roar over the fire's crackle. Jack tested the ropes, tight but sloppily knotted. The boy's fingers twitched, inching toward a shard of rock half buried nearby. Smart kid. Jack shifted, shielding the move, his own hands working the bonds. The Apache warrior watched, silent, then flexed his own wrists, loosening the coils. A pact formed without words: free, fight, survive. Time bled slow, the night deepening, until a distant howl, not coyote but human, pricked the air. The crew froze, heads swiveling. Elias cursed, grabbing a rifle. They came like shadows. The Apache war party hit the camp in a storm of hooves and screams, arrows slicing through the dark. A lookout fell, throat pierced, and the crew scrambled, guns barking. Jack sawed faster, the rope fraying, the boy's rock cutting deep. An arrow thudded into the scarred man's chest, and he dropped, giving the boy space to slash free. He tossed the rock to Jack, who hacked his own bonds loose, then cut the warrior's. The Apache grabbed a fallen knife and lunged into the fray, a blur of vengeance. Jack snatched his Colt from the dirt, round still chambered, and fired. Elias ducked, the shot grazing his arm, but it drew his snarl. The camp erupted, men and Apache clashing in a tangle of blood and steel. Jack dove for cover, dragging the boy behind a crate, his gun spitting fire. Elias roared, rallying his crew, but the tide turned fast. Half his men were down, the rest breaking. Jack locked eyes with him across the chaos, 30 yards of death between them. Elias raised his rifle, but the woman from the plains stepped from the smoke, bow drawn and loosed. The arrow took Elias through the chest, pinning him to a tree, his scream choking off in a gurgle. Jack fired twice more, dropping a fleeing outlaw, then grabbed the boy's arm. "Run!" They bolted for the trees, the warrior vanishing into the fight behind them. Hooves thundered. Dust choked the air, and Jack's ribs screamed with every step. They hit a gully, sliding down in a shower of gravel, the battle's din fading above. Jack leaned against the bank, Colt empty, breath ragged. The boy panted beside him, blood streaking his face, not his own. Above, silence fell, broken by a single, piercing wail. Jack peered up. The Apaches stood victorious, the camp a ruin of bodies and embers. Elias hung limp. The woman's arrow his final mark. She turned, scanning the ridge, and Jack ducked low. They'd won, but he wasn't fool enough to test her mercy twice. The boy clutched his arm, eyes wide. "Horses?" he asked. Jack shook his head. "Gone. We walk." Dawn was hours off, the hills vast and cold, and the Apache's gaze still burned in his mind. Jack Crow slumped against the gully's bank, the Colt a dead weight in his hand, its chambers empty as the night stretched thin. The boy huddled close, his breath fogging in the chill, blood crusting on his cheek from some outlaw's inn. Above, the ravine smoldered, embers winking out like dying stars, the Apache war party's wail fading into an eerie quiet. Elias was dead, pinned to that tree by the woman's arrow, his crooked grin silenced at last. And his crew lay scattered, broken by vengeance not Jack's own. The herd was miles west with Tuck, the horses lost, and Sage waited somewhere in the hills if she hadn't bolted or bled out. Jack's ribs throbbed, his skull ached where the rifle butt had struck. But he was alive. That was more than he'd bet on an hour ago. The boy stirred, his knife sheathed now, his eyes darting to the gully's rim. "They come," he whispered, voice small but steady. Jack shook his head slow, listening to the silence. "Not yet. They got what they wanted. Elias's blood, the horse's justice are close enough for people wronged." But he knew the woman's face, her hate, and the way she'd scanned the ridge. If she tracked them, mercy wouldn't ride along. He pushed up, wincing, as pain lanced through his side, and offered the boy a hand. "We move. Hills'll hide us till dawn." They climbed out, the boy scouting ahead, his bare feet silent on the rock. Jack's boots crunched too loud, every step a gamble. But the dark held no shadows but their own. Sage stood where he'd left her, head low, her flank caked with dried blood. She nickered soft as he approached, and Jack ran a hand along her neck, relief cutting through the exhaustion. "Good girl," he muttered, checking the wound. Shallow, but she'd need rest he couldn't give. He untied her, looping the reins over his shoulder, and they pressed deeper into the breaks, the boy leading toward a creek he swore ran clean. The night wore on, cold seeping into Jack's bones, the stars a map he'd once known by heart. The creek glimmered ahead, a silver thread through the scrub, and they stopped to drink, Sage lipping the water beside them. Jack splashed his face, the sting waking him, and caught his reflection. Haggard, bearded, a man who'd outrun death too many times. The boy sat on a stone, knees drawn up, watching him. "You got a name?" Jack asked, voice rough. The boy hesitated, then said, "Tomas. My PA called me Tom." Jack nodded, filing it away. "Jack Crow. Where's your PA now?" Tomas looked east, eyes distant. "Dead. Them men, Elias's men, killed him. Took me till I ran." Jack's jaw tightened. Another thread tied to the scout's treachery, another life unraveled. "Sorry, kid," he said, meaning it. Tomas shrugged, a gesture too old for his years. "You kill 'em back?" Jack thought of Elias, the arrow, the chaos. "Some. Rest got taken." Tomas nodded, satisfied, and Jack let the silence settle. Dawn crept up slow, gray light bleeding over the hills, painting the creek in soft hues. Jack stood and Sage nudging his arm and weighed his path. West lay the herd, Tuck, a life he'd carved from dust and sweat, hard but his. East stretched the unknown, trails winding toward the Red River, where a man could vanish if he chose. Elias's betrayal had cost him trust, time, nearly his neck. But it had also cut him loose. The Apache might hunt him still, or they might call it even with the camp's ruin. He glanced at Tomas, the boy's thin frame hunched against the cold, and saw a choice he hadn't planned. "You got kin left?" Jack asked. Tomas shook his head. "Just me?" Jack rubbed his jaw, stubble rasping under his fingers. "Herd's west. Food, work if you want it. I ain't soft, but I'm fair." Tomas studied him, then the hills, and Jack saw the war in his eyes. Stay lost, or tethered to something new. "Or you walk," Jack added. "You rode." Thomas kicked a pebble into the creek, watching it sink. "West," he said finally, voice firm. Jack dipped his head, a pact sealed without fuss. They moved out, Sage limping between them, the hills falling away as the plains opened wide. The sun broke free, a thin gold line searing the horizon, and Jack felt its warmth prick his skin. He'd chased no more ghosts. Elias was gone, the herd waited. And the boy walked beside him, a shadow he hadn't sought but wouldn't shake. The Apache might come, or they might not. The plains didn't care, vast and unyielding as ever. Jack's hand rested on Sage's reins, steady now, and he kept his eyes forward. Miles off, a hawk wheeled high, its cry sharp against the dawn. Jack watched it soar, a black speck against the endless sky, free in a way he'd never be. But the ground beneath his boots was solid, the day knew, and that was enough. For now, it had to be. "Hey, folks, glad you stopped by my channel. I share stories here about cowboys and Indians, tales of honor, grit, and love. These are my takes on the rough days of the Wild West. If you enjoy them, feel free to subscribe or drop a comment. I'd love to hear what you think means a lot to me."